I'd like to introduce Jim Fruchterman, our speaker for today. I've known Jim for over the last 14, 15 years, and he's a pioneer in the field of accessibility. Now, I've always known that Jim was a genius, and I always know that what I believe is right, and I was proven right yesterday because he got the Code Genius Award. He's one of this year's MacArthur Fellowship Award winners. Jim's done a lot of interesting work in the technology field and focuses a lot of his technology work today on users with special needs, which makes his perspective here at Google very interesting. He'll be talking to us about universal access and universal accessibility. The way I think about it, if you look at the Google search engine, we scour the whole web and do very well at covering what we call the long tail of content. So if our algorithms excel at finding that right piece of nugget of information that's hidden away in the long tail. And if you think about accessibility, one way to view it is users are not all made the same either. Just as each user cares about a different piece of content, each user is different. And today what we've done with our interfaces is do an excellent job of addressing what Jim refers to as the head, where a lot of users are. But as you sort of then go down that tail, what does it mean to make the world's information accessible to everyone, meaning truly everyone? So take it away, Jim.
Okay, thanks a lot, TV. All right. So I'm here as an engineer, high-tech entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, and activist. And so that's a lot of things, but I'm an old guy, so I've done a lot of these things. So what I want to do is kind of cover how I got into this particular way of using technology, basically helping people who are not necessarily the people that the average high-tech industry focuses on. That's sort of 10% of humanity that's rich, sighted, speaks English, well, maybe it's 5% of humanity, whatever. But anyway, instead, thinking a little bit more broadly about what things do. So going back, I went to Caltech. I was an engineer. And the one good idea I came up with in school was while learning how to make smart bombs. So I was in a modern optics class, and we were learning how to make an optical pattern recognition device. And of course, the example, this being the 70s, was how you use that to target a smart missile. And so you would have a camera in the nose of the missile, and then you would have a representation of the target, a tank, a bridge, an airfield. And the machine would go out there, it would scan the environment, find the target, lock on, and go and blow it up. So I went back to my dorm room going, I wonder, is there a more socially beneficial application of this cool technology? And so then I came up with the only good idea I had in school, which was, you can make a reading machine for the blind with that. Now, I didn't know any blind people. I don't know where the idea came from. And of course, being at Tech, I kind of felt like pond scum relative to all these great Nobel Prize winners and all this sort of things, and the first lecture I went to there was by Richard Feynman, so I aspire to a couple of Milla Feynmans on the genius scale. But anyway, but it's I went back, talked to my professor. He said, "Boy, that sounds cool. Good luck." And so I came here to Stanford to study a PhD program. A couple guys, we found out about there was something called business. I had no idea about business. We brought in some speakers into the engineering dorm, Carruthers Memorial. The first one was the head of a private, a personal computer company, and the second guy was running a private rocket company. So I quit my PhD program, joined the rocket company, and the rocket blew up on the launch pad. And so I was sitting there, do I go back to grad school? So I tried to start my own rocket company, and no one gave me $300 million to start my own rocket company. And I was really completely disappointed. So, but then my former boss from the rocket company said, "Hey, I've got this buddy. He's a chip designer at HP Labs, and he has an idea for a company." So we got together at a local restaurant, and he said, "Well, I think that we could make a custom chip that rather than being a general purpose chip like a CPU or a ROM or a memory, could actually read characters, do optical character recognition." And of course, my reaction was, "That's cool. You could make a reading machine for the blind with that." So we went out and, make a long story short, we raised $25 million in venture capital, and we invented what is called omnifont character recognition. So at the time, character recognition came in essentially two flavors. Font specific, And this was just in the era where people were getting away from typewriters. So you would buy a Prestige Elite ball or a Courier New ball, and you could buy an option that would read that font, but only that font. Or you had machines like the Kurzweil machine where you could train it. You would teach the machine. So what we did instead of that approach is we gathered millions of examples of characters, and we got a network of 40 Sun 2s at the time, and we compared every one to every other one, and kind of came up with a map of what an E was like in our feature space and what a C was like. And then we could say, oh, this character is pretty close to an E or a C, and we draw different boundaries around that. So we actually came up with something that could read anything. And this is what was crucial to make a successful reading machine for the blind, because if you try to scan a document and it doesn't work 90% of the time, you're not going to keep beating your head against that, But if you could actually read 80 or 90% of the documents pretty well, you actually had something useful, not only for blind people, but for lawyers reading contracts and the Postal Service routing the mail and insurance claim forms and the like. So we built a company, we did this, and of course we sold the venture capitalists on this big market for optical character recognition. But secretly, we still wanted to build a reading machine for the blind. So after about 5 years, we had a secret team building this reading machine. And you would take a piece of paper, and you'd stick it in the scanner. You'd push a button. It would scan the page, taking a picture, do the character recognition, send it over to a PC, and a very mechanical hardware voice synthesizer would say, these are the times that time and souls, but much less quality than that. And so, and our board said, oh, this is really cool. What's the market size? And I said, well, we think it's about $1 million per year. And they said, well, we fail to see the connection to our $25 million investment in your firm. And that's the problem that Benetech and I have been working on ever since, is there are many really cool applications of technology that help people that aren't $100 million markets that are growing at 40% a year. And that's what venture capitalists and high-tech companies generally are looking for. So we went off and we started a nonprofit tech company, a deliberately nonprofit tech company, as opposed to all the accidentally nonprofit tech companies that I had been starting. And we, within 2 years, became a $5 million a year social enterprise. So it's the only high-tech company I've ever been associated with that actually beat business plan. But partly it's because our expectations were set so low. And what we did is we actually created a charity. So it was actually what's called a 501c3. That's the charitable status. But inside, it looked like a regular high-tech company. We had a product manager. We had tech support people. We had developers. We had one salesperson. And so we went out and we, over the 1990s, sold 35,000 reading machines, reading a dozen different Western European languages with customers in 60 countries. And during that entire time period, we were profitable, but we would just spend the extra money on more engineering or more outreach or whatever. And so we ran within 1% of break even. So in 1999, everyone thought I was absolutely an idiot for not trying to start a regular for-profit company because everyone was going to become a multi-billionaire. And so, but I decided, let's do more of this. And so we started talking to people about raising money, and about that time, a venture capital back group bought our reading machine for the blind business from us for several $1 million. And we took that money, and since we were a charity, I couldn't pocket it. We put that money and we created several new tech ventures. And some of these are, I think, very relevant to the main topic of my conversation today, which is accessibility and access to information. The first new venture I came up with was because Eileen Richardson, who is the acting CEO of Napster, lived 2 doors down. And her teenage son gave my teenage son Napster, late 99. And so I came home and I said, hey, Jimmy, what's this new icon on the PC? Oh, Dad, it's this Napster thing. A kid a couple doors down, his mom works on it. So, oh, cool. So we spent an hour playing music. He would play 90s punk, and I would play Pat Benatar to show that we had music like that too when I was young. And we went back and forth. And then I said, gee, Jimmy, how much did we pay for this? And he said, well, nothing, Dad. And I said, and of course, I'm a software guy, right? I'm like, oh my God, this is so illegal, but it's so cool. And so immediately the idea came to my mind, could we do this for blind people? Because we had all these people, 35,000 people, scanning books, and it takes 2 or 3 hours to scan a book by hand. And then if you want to proofread it, it takes a lot more hours. giant pain in the ass. And a bestseller would come out, hundreds of our users would be scanning it the same week. And there was no legal way they could share it. So I did a little bit of, and I called this, of course, Bookster, right? So I ran around and started talking about Bookster, and people said, well, that sounds kind of cool. And then someone told me, if you call it Bookster, the publishers will sue you into the ground. So we renamed it Bookshare, and we found out that doing this is actually legal under US copyright law. Now, they never could have imagined the Napster model when they put this change in the mid-90s into the copyright law, but it said a nonprofit serving the people with disabilities do not have to pay a royalty or get permission to provide access to books. So we can scan any book we want to, and we don't have to get permission or anything. So, whoa. And of course, the traditional model of providing books to blind people is you hire professional narrators with real nice human narrator voices, and they record a book, and it costs $5,000, $10,000 a book to do it this way. Or you can do it with volunteers, and there's a volunteer studio here in Palo Alto. Recording for the Blind Dyslexic has a studio. And that costs them $2,000 or $3,000 if you include all the staff time and the mastering cost and that. Well, if you get blind people already scanning books, even with a little bit of staff time just to make sure we're obeying the copyright law, less than $50 a book to put in. And this is in low volumes, so we start scaling up. So the other thing we did is we went to the publishers a year before launching, and we addressed their copyright committee. And this is, of course, a group of people that some people at Google are actually talking to these days, And I described this dream of Bookshare and how we're going to do this, and they said, actually, I think it was the main lawyer for the association said, no one has ever come to us and told us of their plans to steal our stuff in advance before. And I said, it's not theft, it's the bargain in copyright law between IP owners and society. And yeah. Can we actually kind of work with you a little bit here? And so we made a few concessions in terms of digital rights management, but in general, when one of our users gets a book, they can unlock the DRM container and take it out of the lock. Why? Because people who want access to books want to do a gazillion different things to it. They want to stick it on a Braille note taker and carry it around with them. They want to rip it to MP3 using a voice synthesizer and carry it on an iPod. If they have low vision, they want to print it large. They want to print it in Braille. So what we did instead of providing strong locks, which is the traditional digital rights management approach, we provide essentially weak locks. Think of it as like zip. And strong social pressure, okay? Here's this book. We're giving you a lot of power over it because you need it for access. Don't screw up the rest of the community who can't read print books by posting it for free on the internet. And so when the publishers heard we were serious about essentially not screwing their mainstream market, they got really supportive. And of course, as you may not be surprised, Tim O'Reilly gave us all of his O'Reilly books for free to distribute globally to people around the world. And that's one of the limitations about using a copyright exemption thing, is that it only applies in the US. So right now, actually 3 years after Tim O'Reilly gave us global rights, we're starting to work on the major publishing industry to give us those rights so that we can provide books to everyone. So that's kind of, oh yes, question?
Did he give you the rights, or did he just give it to you in electronic format?
He gave us the electronic content in beautiful DocBook XML with permission. And so as new books get published, they just FTP them to us. And so, I mean, O'Reilly is a great company. And so, but we also, and I'm going to touch on these things briefly before going into sort of more of the accessibility wrap. We wanted to work in the human rights field. And because we had been break even during that time period, we didn't have any extra money. But when we got the several $1 million for selling our reading machine for the blind business, we went off to all the human rights groups and said, here's an industry that does nothing but process information, and no one writes IT solutions for them. And yes, I mean, they need a web browser, and they need a word processor, and they need a simple database, but fundamentally, a human rights group has lots of other challenges that aren't necessarily well solved by your off-the-shelf solution. And so one of them is cryptography. I mean, human rights groups have their PCs stolen at a greater rate than any other kind of group on the planet, right? So, because it's an information processing. How do you hurt them? Well, if you're in a country where they're not killing you, they steal your computers. So what we do is we built strong crypto. We made it look like essentially a Eudora Lite. So it's something familiar user interface, and built private key crypto in there. and free backup services, and it just happens automatically. So you sign in with your name and password, and the crypto and the backup happens automatically. And yet this tiny grassroots group in the human rights, in some developing country actually controls their information and who gets to see it, which is the key thing. So we are now probably the leading IT group that solves problems for human rights groups. We're running software for environmental groups, and we're doing a humanitarian landmine detector. But about half of what we do is around, I'll call it broadly literacy, access to information. And one of the things that's happening is, the world is moving to a place where we're moving away from sort of a charity model for solving society's problems. The charity model works great when you are a prisoner of war. That's where the Red Cross got started. It works great if you've just been hit by a hurricane or a tsunami and you need food and shelter. And there's always going to be a need for charity. But one of the things that we found is that applying charity to things like technology often doesn't work. Give someone a free piece of technology, odds are half the time they won't use it. So what you want to do is actually make the technology accessible and affordable. And one of the great things, of course, about the PC industry, the networking industry, the web-based industry, is that we've made lots and lots of technology with very low marginal cost to serve these other audiences. So that's actually my core mission, actually, as a nonprofit here in Silicon Valley, is to spread the word about how easy it is to do things that access the larger population. And Raman used the long tail argument, where Google is focusing on the long tail of web content. But of course, the tail, and the long tail and the bulge all depend on what your frame is. So if you think about web content, yes, but then if you talk about all the world's information, we're not even beginning to scratch all the world's information. How are we going to get access to that? And so that's where something like Google Print and Google Library comes from, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But it's to try and get that initial information and actually reframe it. Well, think about the long tail in terms of humanity. Okay? Right now, Google does a good job of serving a certain number of people who have PCs, to a much lesser extent have other kinds of devices, and provides them with access to this information. But the majority of humanity is still left out of this equation. And so part of my advocacy is that the marginal cost to serve the rest of humanity with technology and information that they can actually use is going down all the time. And we have immense power as technologists, as entrepreneurs, to apply that technology, that content, that expertise, that money to solving these problems. And it's actually quite easy. So first of all, in making information accessible, one of the most popular concepts in accessibility is universal design. If you make it easy for everybody, your market is actually going to go up, because the average user of technology is not a 35-year-old, average height and weight, Caucasian male. Okay? That actually does not represent the majority of humanity. So if you actually start broadening who you're designing for, you'll start saying, I'm doing something for people with low vision. Oh, well, guess what? Most people over 60 have some form of image deterioration, visual deterioration, and it helps them. There are a lot of people who don't hear so well. They won't claim to be deaf, but we all know people who don't hear so well. And so if you can do something that allows them to get access to information not purely in an auditory fashion, you've actually increased your market. And of course, it's much harder to retrofit a solution with accessibility than it is to build it in from the get-go. And I think that that's a lot of what the accessibility movement is about, is trying to get people, developers, the people who write the specs, the product managers, to actually think, okay, it's going to add 0.5% to our development cost to add in these extra features. And you know what? It might actually enlarge our market by 5% or 10%. But people haven't been used to thinking that way. But we're now starting to realize that, to be as successful as our companies want to be, we need to do that. And I keep making that argument on both sides of the equation. It makes business sense and it makes social sense. And if it doesn't make business sense, I'm going to make the social sense argument next. But and some people will go purely on the social argument. Some people will go on the business argument. But I'm pretty familiar with the way things work in Silicon Valley. Just like my venture capitalist who said, "You've got to be kidding," when I said we were going to go after this $1 million market. Investors and business unit managers are always looking for how to make some money. So what I want to do is help people frame these important social missions in terms of why it makes business sense. So as we sort of look at some of these accessibility issues, Google is increasingly ground zero for a lot of these accessibility issues. And I'm going to touch on a few of those examples. As a technology, Google started off with an incredibly accessible tool. Okay? Simple user interface equals universal accessibility equals ease of use for blind people and people who aren't very tech savvy and people who don't read very well. So the less cluttered your presentation is, the better. So it turns out that what Google was doing was great. And now Google is experimenting with lots and lots of additional services and products, and people aren't thinking about accessibility when they're building them. And so we're getting a steady stream of new capabilities that suddenly an existing part of Google's user base can't use. And suddenly the sort of vision of Google as providing accessible information starts to get chipped away. And people are going to come to you and say, do it because it's the right thing. And at Google, I think that argument gets more attention than it does at, say, it did at Microsoft when we started working on them many years ago. But there are going to be other pressures. I mean, I've talked to both the national blind organizations who are discussing, should we be suing Google over Google Print? Because Google Print is scanning all these books and providing them in an image-based format that a blind person can't read. So I, as a sighted person, can look at that page and read it, and Raman and Jim can't. And, is that fair? Well, I don't know. What's the business case? Harder to make, but I think it's part of the social responsibility of the organization to start thinking about how to solve that problem. Oh, sorry, Jim. And then we run into the other issue. It's not our stuff, okay? Fundamentally, when Google is scanning books, it belongs to somebody else. And then you're looking to copyright law and fair use and other concepts to get access to these books. So for the public domain books, no problem. For, let's call them the orphan works, the books that are out there but no longer in print, hard to, people probably don't care. I don't think the publishers and authors really care about whether you guys scan a 1940 novel that hasn't been in print for 20 years or 60 years. I mean, they don't care. And then you've got essentially that front end of the bulge, right? The current bestsellers, the 200,000 books that people are actively interested in. So, and I do know that Google is working directly with publishers to sign them up for those sort of current books. So it's a permission thing. So Google actually has signed an agreement with a lot of these publishers that says, we won't give the entire book to anybody. We will only do this, this, and this. And then when I show up and say, well, do accessibility, they say, oh, well, we've already committed to the publishing industry that we can't do that. So it's been an interesting challenge for us. And it turns out that because of the current conflict between publishers and Google, the publishers don't want to make any concessions to Google, even for a socially beneficial thing. So at the moment, we're at a stalemate. For example, there was one of the 5 biggest publishers who was working with us and with Google before Google Print was announced, Google Library was announced. So it was back when it was a permission-based kind of deal. And they were going to give Google permission to give us all their current bestsellers that they're providing digitally. And when the big thing blew up, the publisher said, oh God, no, we don't want to do it with Google right now. How about we give you the content directly, just like O'Reilly is doing, but don't tell anyone we're doing it. So now we've got a pile of great, new, perfect, best-selling books with global rights, because we also convinced them to give us global rights, but we can't tell anyone who it is. And so now I'm going around trying to convince the other publishers, well, I have one of your cohorts, but I can't tell you who it is. And they're like, is there a problem? I say, well, So anyway, it gives you some idea of some of the complexity. But it gets back to, if you think about the publishers and you think about what does it cost them to give us the rights to serve blind people around the world. How many books are they selling to blind people around the world right now? Not a lot. And so from my standpoint, I say, well, it's the sleeves off your vest. Why should you care? Just go ahead and give it to us. And as long as we can uphold the social deal, they'll give it to us. Well, start taking this argument a step further. Blind people aren't the only disadvantaged people in this world, right? There are people with other disabilities, and there are an awful lot of people who are poor. And we're not serving them all that well. How about you give me the right to deliver that same digital book to poor people in the developing world? And, you know, tell you what, I'll even give you half of the money I make. And I promise you that whatever your sales were for books in Sierra Leone, I'll triple it. You know, even at half of whatever I charge, even if I only charge $1. And so I think that what I want to give you some idea is that we have access to the intellectual property owners, the authors and the publishers. We do business with them. We, speaking generally, Silicon Valley, Google, and the like. And people innately would like to do the right thing as long as they don't get screwed by it. And so we have to construct these kinds of deals to make this possible. One of the other Genius Award winners, I'm sorry, MacArthur Fellowships, I got to use the politically correct term, is Victoria Hale. And she runs a nonprofit pharma company in San Francisco. And it's exactly the same analog. You know, there's this drug. It saves 100,000 lives a year. Those are poor people in India. Why would any pharmaceutical company ever do that? And none will. Because 100,000 poor people a year can never pay what it costs to do a clinical trial in the US. And so they drop that drug like a hot potato. It's the same thing that happens in almost every other area that involves intellectual property. And so if we can go to them and say, well, why don't you license us the right to go after this thing? So Victoria goes and says, give me the right to make this drug to fight this parasite disease that affects people in India. And if the drug turns out to be useful for something else, you can continue to sell it in, you know, if it turns out to be good for lifestyle issues in North America, you know, because that's where the money is. So accessibility is the same kind of thing. You know, we've got immense amount of information. We've got it in immense server farms. We're getting our hands on it. We have platforms that are dirt cheap. There are 1 billion cell phones in the hands of people around the world. In another few years, there are going to be 2 billion cell phones. How do we use the incredible infrastructure for low marginal cost to change the world? And the next project that we're getting launched is we've taken a technology that was developed for people with Down syndrome. It's designed around teaching Down syndrome young adults to read. And we're doing it, we're beta testing it here at CAR, which is on Middlefield Road in Palo Alto. It's the local rehab center that focuses on people with developmental disabilities. And the whole idea is that if you're a young adult with a developmental disability, you're no longer in school. You don't have access to a primary school teacher. And yet, if you can learn to read, your chance for an independent life, to live alone or live in a group home rather than an institution, your ability to be independent, get a job, goes way up if you're literate. So imagine that you have content based on Creative Commons licensed images, so like Flickr images, because I don't want to pay AP for what they want to charge me for their pictures, and a little bit of text, you know, a 16-page book on Tiger Woods. Tiger wears red. Great picture of Tiger Woods. And then in the corner, there's a little teacher icon that instructs the literate but inexpert teacher, the parent, the volunteer, the special education aide, how to teach reading. Gee, Tiger wears red. Look at Tiger's red shirt. Do you know what letter the word red starts with? Is it L, R, or T? And then if the person chooses L, you say, well, it could be L, but then it would sound like this, lead. But it's red, so it's R. Let's go on. And of course, that's the way an expert teacher would teach it, as opposed to me, which might say, no, you stupid kid, it's not L, it's R, R. You know, that's not actually the way to teach reading. So we're actually rolling this out for developmentally disabled people. But you know, can you imagine the exact same content on a cell phone and a literate 12-year-old girl teaching her illiterate mother how to read on the family cell phone? Okay, it's technological barriers, zip. Licensing barriers, nothing, because we have Creative Commons, you know, images that we can distribute everywhere. So what it is more of a distribution operational challenge. And is some company going to get really rich on it? No. At least not now. So someone has to do it. So part of what my mission is to encourage the people who control technology and content to be open-minded about these social applications of their technology. Low marginal cost, protecting you from essentially leakage into your main market or undercutting your main financial strategy. And whether you go off and do it yourself, you know, as an entrepreneur, that just chooses to wear a social hat, or whether you do it as a company that decides to do it as part of your social responsibility, or you just let someone do it. Let's not erect artificial barriers to making sure that everyone benefits from the information in this world and the technology that we've all helped create. So thank you very much. So I'm happy to go into answering questions and focusing more on anything that you guys are interested in hearing about. So, do we have any questions? Raman, is there something that you want to make sure I said?
I think you did a very good job of covering the basics. Let's see if people have questions and then we can start putting it into it.
You get into a deep accessibility discussion. Okay. Yes?
Have you seen any problems with leakage of content? You said that that's sort of the social contract you have with them.
Yeah, and so the social contract is not perfection, but active, honest efforts to minimize the damage. Okay? Because if I go to someone and say, I've got a perfect theorem and no one will ever violate it, that's like a challenge. So we have suspended the accounts of less than 5 blind people who have violated our terms of service by distributing the books to people that they weren't supposed to distribute them. And when the publishers hear that we've actually done that, that reassures them, partly because no publisher on the planet wants to sue a blind person, even if they've broken the law. But as an organization that's in this community, we can actually say, look, and our community agrees with us, look, this is part of the deal. Let's not post that book for free on the internet, okay? Because, and of course, publishers all know that all of these books are published for free on the internet already anyway. Okay? It's part of trying to encourage people who can afford the books to actually buy the books and not being a source of people who could afford to buy the book to get it for free. And that's actually more important. I'll give you a really kind of a funny example is we worked with the publishers for a year, and then we heard from the science fiction and fantasy writers of America, which is the most technically savvy authors group. And there is no authors association. Every genre has its own. There's a mystery writers guild. And so the science fiction writers showed up, and every science fiction writer that I had read as a kid started sending me email like, you are the devil incarnate! You are stealing my stuff! And I'm like, oh my God, Ben Boba hates me. I mean, what did I do wrong? And so, and I kept going, no. And I said, I talked to the publishers. Turns out science fiction writers hate publishers with a passion because most of them aren't making a living being a science fiction writer. So they actually threatened to sue us, even though what we were doing was legal. And I went in there and I just said, look, we're really a nonprofit. We're really only helping disabled people. We will support you in fighting e-piracy because the electronic piracy of books is the most rampant in the science fiction area for probably obvious demographic reasons. And we'll give any author who wants rights to come and inspect the book on Bookshare and look at the number of errors from our scanning and proofreading. And if it falls below higher than our minimum threshold, or as we said, a higher bar, the publisher can ask us to pull the book until the author can ask us to pull the book until we fixed it. And in exchange, the science fiction authors will encourage all science fiction authors in their membership to give us the direct digital content for free globally so we can serve blind people. 0 authors have asked for access, but dozens of authors have given us global permissions. It really was making more of an acknowledgement that authors are important and that we cared about their economic issue. They were willing to let us have the 1% of the population who cannot pick up a book and read it normally. Yes?
So if authors are important, do you see a future where publishers continue to be important, or can we bypass publishers altogether?
I see authors being in a stronger position versus publishers in the future. So, we now see people developing their books online or insisting on a Creative Commons licensing deal as part of their publishing contract. And, I'll contrast the publishing industry to the recording industry, okay? The publishing industry fundamentally is more socially minded and conscious and has traditionally done these kind of deals for society on the side, whereas the recording industry never has.
To a blind person?
In a moment. Yeah. So I think the publishing industry is a little bit more socially minded, but the latest issue of Wired talks about bans going around the RIAA, and I think that's probably a good thing. I think we'll see a sort of a more robust culture where I see a lot more self-published books. They're actually quite good, just because they can't convince a publisher to do it, and yet the 500 people you really most want to read that book are probably not going to be able to read that book. So.
In China, it's interesting. It seems like they settled on this model where after like distribution of music is legal, and just expect to make money by more famous
and doing more concert
doing
gigs.
concerts or doing advertising, licensing deals, and so on. They don't expect any money for it.
I'll give you an example of a great country model. In Hungary, if you win the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Literature in Hungarian, they pay you, I think, the equivalent of 3 times a normal wage per year, and all of your works become electronically available to all Hungarians for free. I mean, and no one turns it down, And so, but I mean, so I think we've got a lot of different models, and actually that was one of my pitches to the publishers is, it costs our members $50 a year for all the books they can read, and we have 150 daily newspapers that land on our site every morning. We get a direct feed from the newspaper industry, and we format it into digital braille or into digital talking books, and we download it directly to users. And $50 a year for all you can read. I said, look, this is a chance for an all-you-can-eat model that you guys can watch, and if it works, you can say, what a great idea, let's do that. And if it doesn't work, you can say, what a terrible idea. But of course, that was that special social thing. So, I think this experimentation actually leads to a much greater access to people. Yes, ma'am? Yeah.
More comment. I found your talk really inspirational. I have a very close friend who's living in Canada, developed country. She has a university degree, we went to college together. And as I see my career increasing, I see her options becoming more and more limited because she is severely dyslexic. She got her degree by working much harder than I did because she had to listen to all of her textbooks on tape. And they were read by people who were volunteers, so they were hard going. And she looks at the paperless office, the distributed office, she looks at Microsoft products, these are all barriers to her. She can't apply for a tech job because she can't follow the email thread easily. And when she applies for a job, they look at what she's sending out and they say, oh, there's spelling errors, the person must be an idiot. And what she said when I joined Google was, she said, I love Google. And I said, yes, I love it too. And she said, no, I love Google because when I search, unlike anywhere else, Google says, did you mean to spell it this way? And I would love to see that kind of approach in all of our products. That would delight me.
And of course, the nickname in the accessibility field are virtual curb cuts. Curb cuts are put in so that people in wheelchairs can go, on the corner, can go up on the sidewalk from the street. Well, it turns out, of course, that the most frequent users of curb cuts are not people in wheelchairs. It's people pushing baby strollers and delivery guys with boxes and a cart. Everyone gets benefits from it. So it turns out that in many, many cases, a technology that helps disabled people helps non-disabled people. It's that universal design concept. And what I meant to type instead of what I did type helps a lot more people who aren't dyslexic than who are, but a lot of us just mistype. So, and actually, Bookshare is also for people with severe dyslexia, so they don't have to hire a reader and all that kind of stuff. So that's probably our biggest potential market. But we kind of start with the blind because they're the most technically savvy, and then we branch out through schools to the kids with dyslexia. It's much harder to identify dyslexic people once they're out of school.
The way it works in Canada, she has a card that says she's legally blind, so that she has access to those books.
Yeah.
In the United States, the technical term is print disability. So the print disability covers both people with visual impairments as well as people with hearing disabilities.
Or with a physical disability where they can't hold a book, like cerebral palsy or something like that. So great. Yes, Jim.
I have a actually non-accessibility question first. In the non-accessibility world, what are the biggest technological challenges that you have? I'm thinking specifically about in the human rights space that you're talking about, but anywhere else you might talk about. What are the biggest technological issues?
Well, of course, the odd thing is that the issues generally aren't the technology. The issues are lousy connectivity, an ISP that's run by essentially the secret police, people who, the reason that they're human rights activists is because their family was murdered and they were a farmer. And now they're very passionate about their cause, but, they didn't go to university, they don't know how to use tech, and now they're being thrust into this role. That's actually, throughout the social sector, I say the social sector is often 2 to 20 years behind the business sector in terms of its use of technology. And yet, I mean, think about some of the problems we're facing, you know, global illiteracy, HIV/AIDS, economic development, women's empowerment. I mean, all these issues that technology is going to be a piece of. And even if you assume that we have a limited amount of resources, if we make those resources work twice as hard, then we can get twice as much social good for a certain amount of money. So, I mean, technically, you know, I'll tell you what we do, and I'll be quite honest. One of our metrics for a project is low technical risk. You see, our business plan is we're going to try and take a technology from a company or you know, or from a lab or a university, and we're going to try and make it into a standalone, self-supporting tech venture for $1 million or $2 million bucks. So if we have to hire an army of programmers to invent something from scratch, that's your sort of $10 or $20 million project, not your $1 million project. So we go for low technical risk. So usually it's much more in this operational risk. And also, the fact is that we have very few competitors. And that's kind of scary sometimes because we don't actually know what the right solution is. And one of the things that, you know, we keep finding out working, for example, with disabled people or human rights groups or environmental groups is the problems we think they have are not the problems that they think they have, and usually they're right. And so we have to actually pay some attention to that. Occasionally you can invent something completely new that they don't know that they need, and then they like it. But that's the exception rather than the rule. Usually, you know, that's a straightforward thing. So, yes?
So what are the greatest sort of unnecessary barriers to your mission these days? What's the low-hanging fruit?
Okay. I'll contrast it with Silicon Valley's high-tech approach. If I create a brand new startup company in Silicon Valley, or I create a great project inside of a high-tech company, and the technology works, and customers are excited, and it's going to grow fast, the money flows. Not easily, but I mean, we definitely have a way that we reward success with more resources, and you can take off. Okay, the social sector works in the opposite way. Okay, if you want to get big, well, grantors, traditional foundations will say, well, we funded you 2 or 3 years ago. We're done now. We're on to the next thing, right? And, oh, you're big, so you must not need our support anymore. So actually, the access to growth capital for scale is probably the #1 issue for social entrepreneurs. And actually, in the next couple of weeks, I have a paper coming out on this that I co-wrote with a guy from Calvert, which is one of the leading socially responsible investment funds, as well as Jed Emerson, who's sort of a very famous homeless advocate here in San Francisco. And it's all around, you know, can we actually set up a system in the social sector that rewards risk-taking rather than punishes it, and it punishes it in a lot of ways, not just money, and then actually encourages people to go off and do this. And it's one of the reasons why I'm excited about technology is that, you know, to a great extent, most of the things that we're doing have been developed by somebody else, tried out, the technical risk is low, and I'm building out the last social mile. You know, and, you know, I mean, I don't know, of course, my brain goes to, you know, Google's founders, right? And Bill Gates and all this kind of stuff. I mean, Bill Gates can set out to vaccinate every kid on the planet, and it's not a stupid idea. He might not succeed, but it's plausible. And, you know, and he's got a team of people there who are sort of systematic going about it, you know. There are 100 people in Silicon Valley who could set out to have illiteracy on the planet and have a 1 in 5 chance of succeeding. You know, it's actually plausible. I think people forget the amount of power and leverage that are here in this community that we usually use to create new companies and new ideas. Well, social ideas are actually some of the coolest problems that you could be working on. How do we actually make it possible to make a living doing that? Because, you know, I talked to an MBA student who comes out of grad school with $100,000 worth of debt. You know, I may not be able to convince them to go work in the social sector for $40,000 a year. You know, there's a fundamental structural problem there. So some of the MBA schools are actually setting up something where they'll forgive all your debt if you go into the social sector. Yeah, and, you know, why don't we do that for engineers? You know, I mean, lawyers have a pro bono tradition. Doctors, you know, will volunteer in low-income clinics. Right now, we focus our effort on the open source area, which, to be honest, is mainly geeks developing for other geeks rather than geeks developing for the rest of humanity. And so, how do we set it up? I mean, we have a few good examples. You know, I think you know, Mitchell Baker at Mozilla is actually, you know, their average customer is not a technologist. Now they're building on the back of a whole bunch of open source work that was done with Mozilla because technologists were passionate about it, but it gave them that platform that then they could add, you know, the user interface experience, a little bit of product management, and then go off and take over whatever it is, 8 or 10% of the browser market. We should be doing this in every area you can imagine, and it's within our power. Anyway, do it. So, any more questions? Raman, you had one?
As you were saying what you were saying, I was about to cut in and say, but engineers do open source, but then you mentioned open source. So I believe the piece that is missing is the rest of the story that sort of brings together that end-user solution. As you said, geeks develop for geeks. And so I know open source sell that solution I developed for myself works very well, honestly. So what do you think is required to sort of do that last social mile for open source? Because clearly we have a main platform.
Yeah.
If you look at the one laptop per child, if you look at Firefox, we have all the bits there, but still, I still believe that the accessibility angle is in large part missing in the open source world because it's not viewed as being very fun or sexy to work on. It's sort of, in zero, it's the noise and the boring thing, I have to do this plain looking boring thing with big fonts and large dots for this blind guy who has. And it seems to be missing that final spark of passion that gets these tools to solutions where you can actually finally say, I have a tool that's been done right for me, as opposed to using something that was done for somebody else, and you're sort of representing yourself into that.
I look at this issue as just another version of the volunteer challenge. We get a lot of volunteers. People who want to volunteer for us. And if you're a book lover and you like chopping books apart and proofreading books, we've got a web-based solution where we can manage hundreds, actually thousands of volunteers with a quarter-time person because we've invested the time into the infrastructure. But if you come into us and say, I'm an expert in crypto and I want to come and help you guys, it takes a lot of our mind share. So we actually have to design a project so that you as the crypto volunteer, the expert techie, can come in and help us out, and it's also a good use of our time. So these volunteer deals are this sort of bargain. The open source community right now delivers acknowledgement, which is is the primary currency of a volunteer. Did what I do make a difference? And it makes the kind of changes that you want to make pretty plausible. I want to see this patch in Apache because I need this capability, and what is it, Eric Raymond, scratch your own itch then. So what we're trying to do, and this is something I'm hoping that we do with some of the money that we're increasingly getting, is to set up sort of these more structured volunteer options where, again, we're going to start small. 2 to 5 people can volunteer 10 hours a week, and have us tell them, you may not know what blind people in the developing world need, but we've spent time with them. Our product manager, the project leader actually know what they need, and if you do this, it's going to matter. And I think Firefox did a good job of that and managed to keep the community. We need to replicate more models of that. And I know that the spirit is there. I mean, Brian Bellendorf, Mr. Apache, right? He's like, I want to do more social stuff. I'm like, I want to help you do more social stuff. So anyway. But I don't know, Raman, if that addressed your question, but I think people need a real opportunity. And I think people need a model that's different than the ones that we traditionally have, which is make a lot of money, and then we have this other more socially oriented model, open source. And I think like the open content movement is a great example of something that's kind of bridging some of these gaps. I mean, the average user of open content is not a geek helping a geek. It's someone sharing a picture on Flickr. Or a band that decides that putting out their stuff on open content is going to actually help them get more gigs, and therefore they're going to make more money and a better living. So I think we need to keep that going. So, yes?
My 96-year-old grandmother's finally lost her vision completely. She's never touched a computer. Is there any way she can benefit from the Bookshare that you do?
Yes, but this will be an interesting statistic. The majority of blind people in the US are over 60. Okay? Less than 5% of Bookshare users are over 60. Okay? And there's some reasons for this. One is computer comfortableness. I mean, we don't have a human speaking these books. We have a voice synthesizer speaking the book. And the average senior, especially of the 80 to 90 cohort, runs screaming from the room when the computer starts speaking, even though we've made some advances, okay? So generally it's the person, so what you do is say, well, what are the solutions available to someone and what do they want to accomplish? So the Library of Congress provides free books on tape to anyone who's blind. They come through the mail. They're actually delivered on audio cassette tape still, okay? But it's free and the narrators are really high quality. And so I'd say that your average person in their 90s who's lost their vision is taking advantage of Library of Congress's free service, and it probably fills a need that they actually have. If you have someone who's really highly motivated, then there are ways to teach. But I mean, a lot of us have people who are seniors who don't have a disability, and it's hard enough to get them engaged with technology. And so you have to find the hook, whether it's email or digital photography or whatever. So if you can find a hook, your favorite mystery author isn't going to be out for another year, or is never recorded by the audiobook industry. So the only way you're going to read it is by listening to a computer voice. Then we might actually have provide a technology option that someone would actually care enough about to make the effort to do it. And of course, it's incumbent on us to keep making that barrier to use lower. So. Well, great. Well, I wanted to thank you guys. I know it's a little bit after 12, and I really appreciate you coming and hearing about social applications of technology. And if you have great ideas, if you have buddies you couldn't get into Google and you want to send them to us, we're hiring. Of course, I don't want to poach here. You can't compete on salary or anything like that. But I think there is. I think there are a lot of people in the tech world who need to know that these options are out there, and we want to either help them join us or help connect them with some of the other projects, because even though Benetech is not a funder at all, we do our own projects, I'd say that most people who are doing tech social enterprise end up coming through just because, well, you must know where the money is, right? So we try to help them out. I want to thank you guys again for coming today and for being interested in the topic. So.